Well, hello and welcome to our webinar on how to automate and streamline vulnerability management processes. My name is Sonia Blanks, and I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Nucleus Security. Before we begin, we'd love to know who's joining us today. I see, Ned, you've already kicked us off. Feel free to drop your name, your role, or where you're tuning in from into the chat. We'll also settle for emojis. We'd be happy to take those. So if you could just let us know where you're from, we'd love it. Now, we want this session today to be interactive, an interactive discussion with us. So please ask questions throughout this session via the Q&A. And our goal is to help you uncover the many ways automation can support, expedite, enable, and improve your vulnerability management. We know there were also a few changes on who would be speaking in today's webinar, but there's a reason that they say third time's a charm. And I have no doubt that Scott and I will do our best to charm the heck out of you today and drive an excellent discussion. Isn't that right, Scott?
Oh, absolutely. Looking forward to it. We have so much automation to do, and not enough time to talk about it.
Heck yes. And so for those, audience members that may not know you, could you briefly introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Kuffer. I am one of the co-founders of Nucleus Security, and my background is vulnerability management through and through. So this is what I've basically spent my entire career doing, in a very nerdy, geeky way, all the way from in college to now. And very excited to chat with you about some of the things that we've learned over the years on how to automate all the little itty bitty pieces of vulnerability management that you be aware of that you need to.
Love that. Thanks, Scott. Now, I'm looking at the chat. We've got folks from all over. I love it. Even Germany. We've got Germany, Florida, Georgia, Virginia. We really appreciate all of you being here with us today. And let's start talking about automation. So, Scott, I want to show you this slide right here. This is one that we're very familiar with. Could you just talk a little bit about our viewpoint, as a company, really on the role of automation and vulnerability management? Like, where should it be leveraged when you're thinking about these different stages of vulnerability management?
Absolutely. I don't see the slide that you're sharing, but
Oh,
happy
well,
to answer
that
that
would be
question
important.
regardless.
So,
Happy to answer the question regardless.
yeah.
So yeah, as far as when we're talking about automation and specifically with vulnerability management, it's really easy for everybody to be thinking about, oh, how do we do prioritization, or how do we start automating ticket creation and things of that nature. But when we think about automation at its core, what you're really talking about doing is the ability to start reducing manual effort that's required for all different pieces of a vulnerability management process, right? So everything from the ability to say, hey, it might take us 5 minutes to create a ticket, and we might have to create 1 million tickets a year. And therefore, if we can reduce that to 1 minute per ticket, now we've just saved, 4 million minutes, right? So when we're thinking about automation, we need to take a step back and not just look at a single part of the process, because it's really easy as an industry to think about how the stuff that we all love and care about, right? So I think about the CVSS scoring system, EPSS scoring system, SSBC scoring system, but like all of these things are really geared towards one aspect of vulnerability management. But you have hundreds of opportunities on a daily basis to automate individual parts of a VM process that you might not even be thinking about, right? So simple as, hey, I marked something as a false positive today, and I want to make sure that we get a notification when that false positive is out of compliance now from whatever our internal policy is, right? So there's just tons of opportunities. And so when we think about automation, we're really thinking about what's the process behind the process that really makes the thing tick. So that's how we look at it.
Awesome. Are you able to see my slide now?
I am. Yes. Hopefully
Okay.
everybody else.
Perfect. Great. I just want to make sure I didn't jack that part of. All right. So looking at the slide now, do you feel like, or have you seen that most enterprises that you speak with, come into contact with, are actually automating these parts of the process, or do you typically find them focusing on like one piece of this?
I think I think the correct answer to that question is there's the what I wish the answer was versus what the reality is. And I think that we all like to think that we are automating a lot of the VM process, but most often I think a lot of organizations really struggle with each individual part of the process, and for good reason, right? Everything is really challenging. I mean, there's a reason we've spent 30 years trying to get prioritization correct. There's a reason that we've spent 30 years trying to get just how often are we scanning correct, right? Every single step is a huge monumental challenge in its own right. And so what we'll normally see is that one part of a vulnerability management process will get automated pretty well within an organization, and then the rest tend to be very manual. So these would be things like, hey, we're going to try to dump everything into a SQL database, and then we're going to have vulnerability analysts go in and do some action based on that. Maybe we're going to use Excel. Maybe we have a lot of manual ticket reviews, or we try to get vulnerability management into an AppSec pipeline. So I would say more often than not, it's pretty manual in general, but there's generally like 1 to 2 areas within the VM process that most organizations do a pretty decent job of automating.
Awesome. I'd be curious to know from the audience, if you're tuning in, are you using automation now? And if you are, for what parts of the vulnerability management process? I'd just love to see that. Maybe we can incorporate some of that. And thank you for joining us from Canada. That's amazing. Appreciate you sharing that. So I want to talk for a minute about ownership, because that's a big part of all of this, right? And we talk about it quite a bit at Nucleus. And so let's say that you wanted to start the process of starting to streamline your VM process within your organization. What would be that first step?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate, the unfortunate reality of vulnerability management. And man, how many times I'm going to have to say vulnerability management today?
A lot.
We should turn this into a drinking game. But what we find is that when you get started, there's actually a lot of prep work that's required in order to effectively automate a VM process, right? So it's like, it'd be one thing to say, hey, I want to go automate my ticketing workflows. And you could start there, but there's so much work that needs to happen before you can start automating the ticketing workflows. Like even an example of, I think you used this example of ownership, right? Great, we want to automate ownership of, who owns what vulnerabilities. Well, turns out you have to do threat modeling, you have to do asset management, you have to have a pretty solid asset inventory available to you. Like there's all this prep work before you can effectively do VM automation. And so that's the unfortunate part. The good news is that if you can unlock that, what will happen is your ability to execute on the amount of vulnerabilities you can fix actually goes up exponentially, right? And so it's really exciting. It's an exciting opportunity to think about how do we move from this manual based VM process towards automation, because it forces you to mature in all these other areas of your business as well. So that's the first thing is you got to do the prep. But generally, to answer your question directly and not to answer it like a person who's trying to weasel his way out of answering the difficult
No.
question, we generally say you have to start by defining what you want to occur with different vulnerabilities. So there's this concept called vulnerability tracing, which I'm not sure if folks are familiar with, but the idea is you basically take a sampling of vulnerabilities that from any scanner or wherever you're generating your vulnerabilities from, and then actually trace it through its whole life cycle. Like how would you expect it to work? So I would expect this vulnerability to get assigned to this team over here because of these reasons. Once it's been assigned to this team, it would get this due date and SLA set up for these other reasons. Then we were going to say a ticket needs to get created. This ticket needs to get followed up this way. And then what that does is it really at a very small scale allows you to see all of the areas that vulnerability has to get touched throughout its journey. And then if you take a sample, you'll start to see this bigger, broader picture of all the opportunities for where you can automate across the entire ecosystem, which is really exciting.
Awesome. I really appreciate all the engagement in the chat. We're getting a lot coming in. We've got folks from South Africa, France. So just love that we have an international presence today for sure. Seeing a lot of manual processes as we're talking about here, and then automation as it relates to vulnerability scans. And we did get a question, and that question was how to aggregate many sources of security findings / posture. Microsoft starts talking about XSPM. Other AppSec vendors are starting to talk about ASPM. How do you position Nucleus?
Yeah, that's the lovely thing about security is we love our acronyms, and it seems like, I mean, just in the 5-6 years that Nucleus has been around, I mean, Gartner has relabeled our category like 5 or 6 or 7 different times. Like it started out as just VM, then it was TVM, then it was VRM, then it was RBVM, then it was ASPM, depending on CSPM, XSPM, right? Like there's so many different ways you could categorize a tool like this. And so to answer your question, Kurt, I believe when we think about how do you position a tool like Nucleus, we really look at the fundamentals of what the solution is doing. And so when you start looking at the issue, kind of the fundamental issue of having all of your data in one place, you need to start thinking about it at a little bit of a deeper level. And so for us, I mean, we could classify ourselves in any one of those categories and it would be accurate. But I think the thing that it captures, or doesn't capture, I should say, is that by having all of this data in one spot in a normalized view that's correlated together, it actually unlocks all of those different use cases. So by having this data in one spot, and it's not just CVEs, mind you, right? It's vulnerabilities. It is vulnerabilities from your entire technology stack. It's cloud resource type vulnerabilities. It's OT vulnerabilities. It's threat context and vulnerability intelligence data. It's all your asset inventory. Just by combining all this information into one spot, what ends up happening is that turns out you have the ability to automatically set up SSVC style prioritization because you just are linking data sources together. You have the ability to do CI/CD integration to be able to get all your information into the AppSec pipeline. You have the ability to resource with cloud or resolve vulnerabilities in cloud resources, right? Because all that information is there and you're hooked into your cloud services. So when we think about how do you aggregate those different sources of information, I mean, that's what a tool like Nucleus is designed to do. It's designed to bring it all into one spot so that you enable all of those downstream sources. And, you know, we probably label ourselves RBVM just because it's like kind of the closest, most generic acronym that's out there. But you could absolutely position us in, you know, whatever XSPM or ASPM you'd like to put us in as well.
Absolutely. So we've got a couple of comments around asset management and, you know, even the ownership piece. It's kind of an extension of what we were just talking about. And I have faith that you'll be able to address the ownership question I'm about to give you while also rolling in an answer to this asset management piece. So let me read the two comments.
Big hopes.
First one is asset management is huge. Getting those asset attributes populated is and I'm assuming this was meant to be a big challenge to overcome, and then automation can flow freely. And then there was a question that was, what are unique ways to auto-organize assets beyond the normal biz department breakdown org structure? And so I was going to ask you to explain how automation works when it comes to ownership assignment and how can it help, you know, those enterprise VM teams today? And I think you can answer both of those as part of that.
I can, yeah. Let's see, computing.
That's a big one. You got this. I have faith.
We got this. Yeah. So keeping me on my toes. So there's a few things, right? So the first is asset inventory and asset attributes being a huge part of vulnerability management. 100% agree. Basically, my philosophy here is actually that the biggest challenge in vulnerability management is your ability to apply asset management into your VM process, right? Because that really unlocks a lot of what you want to do downstream. So this would be everything from, hey, I don't know where to create tickets if I don't know who owns those assets. And the thing that makes it complex is that there are different types of assets with different types of owners. And so you might even have, if you just look at code repositories, for example, you might have 50 or 75 product teams that are all responsible for individual sets of code repos. And so now you need a process to track who owns those. At the same time, you have your workstations team, your servers team, your Oracle team, your whatever giant Hadoop team. And so they're responsible for different sets of vulnerabilities on different assets. And so you have to be able to manage all of that in one place, and it's generally different teams. So it's a big challenge. So I 100% agree. But what that leads to is when you start aggregating all of that into a single spot where you can normalize into these unique structures, at least from our perspective, the way we look at it is there are obviously there's your standard, like who owns what assets based on where they are in the organization. You have to be able to handle reorganizations, which I know is a topic that we are going to be talking about here a little bit later today. But other ways that we see this is if you think about a hierarchy, right? A hierarchy is one kind of lens to look at your organization. So one way of saying that is like, I'm going to look from the CEO down every single person within my organization. And so I can look at vulnerabilities tied to each individual level of that hierarchy. But if you look at it another way, which is like, hey, let's look at it from the lens of like, what's production and pre-production? What are things that are like, hey, what's processing super sensitive critical data? What's processing not super sensitive critical data, but is associated with a compliance framework? Like maybe I'm responsible for PCI. Now, by having these three different lenses, you can actually combine them together where you can start to say, hey, show me all of my PCI assets that are owned by this particular team that are in production. And now you've effectively combined the three different lenses into one. So you get really precise in how you want to look at ability information and your asset information. And so that's generally some of the ways that we see the asset information getting utilized in a VM program. Because it's great to have it, but you have to be able to make it actionable. And so generally tying it to things that matter to your business is the way that we will see that happen, especially when you're talking about auto organization. A lot of attribute based organization.
Does the automation for ownership bring any specific examples to mind where you've seen it transform or improve a customer's work that they've been doing in VM?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, so, I know, again, we're always looking for better ways to do things, and I can totally appreciate that. But the reality is there's a lot of power in just getting the right information to the person that owns it. And so even saying, hey, we want to auto organize our assets in 5 different ways, but even just by going from, hey, we don't know who owns this vulnerability to every single day, a user can log in to somewhere, it doesn't have to be a Nucleus, but they can go and they can access in real time their vulnerability information. And it's in a prioritized format. So, it's like, hey, 1 through 5, this is what they are. It's hugely, hugely impactful, right? Once you do that, it unlocks the ability to make that part of their performance reviews, right? If you as a business want to decide today that vulnerability management is important and you want to build it into your performance reviews, it's really hard to do that unless you have a system that allows you to give folks the information to execute on that. Because otherwise it's an unfair ask to be able to say, hey, you have to fix vulnerabilities, but they don't know what vulnerabilities they're responsible for. So just by being able to do things like that, it actually provides huge transformation potential in an organization. And when I think about one of even our earlier, right, they were, it was a big organization. It was a kind of government private entity that, was sort of a private government owned private entity in a foreign, in one of our Five Eyes friends countries. And they had, let's say, 500 different products that they were delivering. And they wanted the CEO of that company was required to roll out security for compliance purposes. So they were required to say, hey, everybody needs to fix vulnerabilities within 30 days that are of a certain severity. But the problem that they had was that developers had no idea that those vulnerabilities even existed. So they were doing all this SAST scanning and SCA scanning and DAST scanning, but it was really difficult for them to actually say, hey, the latest set of information across all the different types of scanning we're doing is not available to us. And so what happened was really quickly, they started shipping that information directly to the developers who are responsible for it. And then, then you can also have the added benefit of we have 1 million vulnerabilities, but it's broken down across 6,000 people. That makes it a lot more consumable for each one. And they found they didn't even have to make it part of their performance reviews. Developers wanted to do the right thing. And what ended up happening is there's this crazy culture shock, this like culture change that occurred over the course of 6 months. And security started to be part of their sprint planning and started to be part of, like, they treated them as incidents. And so it really empowered and enabled the team. So I probably went way off down the rabbit hole there, but that was really an example of how we could see by just leveraging some basic principles, you're actually able to get big outcomes.
Yeah, you did not. I think you did great, and you incorporated some other things that I didn't even ask about. So since we've gotten a lot of comments in the chat about manual processes, I do want to pose this question to our audience. What things have made automating more things within your environment difficult? Like, what would you say is like your number one blocker to further automating? Is it like a lack of a tool? Is it internal processes that aren't allowing you to bring something else in? I definitely like to know a little. We got one already, data quality. Thank you, Brooks.
I could have guessed that one.
Yeah, that exactly. We have some guesses on what it would be, what we definitely would love to know. And so with that, talking about manual stuff, I think everyone here that's stuck in manual, I'll say hell, for lack of a better word.
We're getting saucy here at Nucleus.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that you'll understand what we mean by the fact that ticket creation, at least on a manual front, can be so difficult. It's very time consuming and can really be the bane of a lot of teams' existence, right? So how can automation support and help improve that process, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, I think this is probably one of the areas that has the biggest opportunity for an organization if you can start to automate how you leverage ticketing. Because I mean, if we boil it down and we talk about why tickets exist so that you can merge like kind of different requests from a specific team to take some sort of action. And so it can be a little tricky to get ticketing. Not a little, it's a lot of tricky to get ticketing working correctly the way that you want because I mean, if you just think about like even a lot of the ticketing systems are designed to have tickets manually created as opposed to automatically created. So you run into some weird edge cases where, especially when you're looking at like machine generated information like vulnerability data and asset data, and then you're trying to like kind of merge that with manual processes, which is effectively what ticketing is. Ticketing is all about how you take stuff and you merge it into a manual workflow. And so there's the ticketing issue in itself and how much time that takes. But then there's also the kind of bigger, broader questions of like these fundamentally are different processes that we have to somehow merge together. So because of that, huge opportunities, right? So the first thing that you can think about it is you can think about it at the very basic level, right? Just at a very, very simple level. Let's say that I know that I want to create a ticket for some remediation team. Just manually doing that on its own takes a lot of time, right? Because a good ticket is if you don't make a good ticket, it's going to get rejected by the team. They're not going to do the thing. They're going to kick it back, and then that causes churn and like turmoil and cruft in your process. And as the COO of a company, that really makes me sad when those things happen. But it's very similar to what happens in a relationship between product management and regular developers, right? Doesn't matter what the ticket is there's this process of which we submit a ticket, it gets groomed, it gets assessed by the engineering team, and then oftentimes it gets kicked back for more information. Now, imagine you're doing the same thing, but you're doing that in a security context where you're a security person who is not working with each individual team by themselves. You're basically creating these tickets at a broader policy level. And oftentimes those engineers don't really understand what the ticket is. And oftentimes they'll kick it back or they just won't do it. Right. And so when you think about the automation right from the get-go, the ability to create a specific set of information that you can unify across your entire business and then just be able to say, hey, I want to automatically create that ticket based on this information from these vulnerabilities on these assets provides huge value because you're not spending like an hour typing out all of the specific template that your product teams require. And so that's like the very basic, most basic level of how you can automate. And when you're thinking about automation within ticketing, but if you start layering it on top of that, when you start thinking about follow-up of tickets, right? So how do we know that a ticket's getting worked on? How do we know that it's being prioritized appropriately? How do we know that there are updates on that ticket? So there's the creation of the ticket, which is one set of automation. There's the follow-up on tickets. That's a second set of automation. And then there's the how do we layer all of these tickets together from a routing perspective, right? So, if you just think about like traditional prioritization, how do you actually communicate between all these different teams what needs to happen? So, I mean, generally what'll occur in an organization is you've got like a really small vulnerability analyst team, and it's like, hey, we're going to we want you to create tickets for all of these different downstream organizations or downstream teams within your organization. And you as the VM analyst just have to do it, right? And so it can take up your entire day just for creating tickets, just for following up tickets. And then you're not even doing your job as a VM analyst, which is going and analyzing vulnerability information. And so there's like a lot of opportunity to be able to automate that particular set of processes. And so that's the way we look at it from an automation perspective. When it comes to ticketing, it's not just about like, hey, we need to be able to create tickets. It's how do we create good tickets that are going to be accepted by your engineering teams and that are going to be followed up on automatically. And so that's kind of the way that we look at how tickets and automation really work. And it looks like Drew just made a great point, right? If you close a vulnerability, but the ticket hasn't been created, or the ticket hasn't been closed, how do you automatically close that ticket as well? So that you can remove it from the backlog. So 100%, like I can't tell you so I come from the federal government background. I can't tell you like just hundreds. I mean, I'm going to probably use some exaggeration here, but like I feel like fundamentally in my bones that the U.S. government has probably wasted hundreds of millions of dollars just in creating tickets about things that they already knew about. And so I think there's huge opportunity to get rid of this anchor from the industry.
Nice. We did get one question specific to our platform, so let's address that real quick, and then we'll continue on this ticketing path. But the question was, is it possible to use your tool for BIA purpose? Is it possible to upload your own vulnerability catalog?
I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure what the BIA purpose is referring to, but as far as can you upload your own vulnerability catalog? So specifically, Nucleus is what we call a findings management platform. So effectively, we are looking at all of the vulnerability data that we're looking at all the vulnerability data that's being generated in your organization. That can be anything from a set of scanner plugins, right? So from like a Tenable, but it can also be any other type of vulnerabilities that you care about, right? So we would just batch that into, on the Nucleus side, something we call custom vulnerabilities or custom findings, and then you can upload data against those. So I think the answer to your second question was yes, you can upload a vulnerability catalog, but it has to be basically associated it has to be a real finding. It can't just be like, hey, we uploaded a vulnerability catalog, and we call those finding templates, which I'm happy to talk to you about. And
BIA,
business impact.
Business impact analysis, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I mean, it's a great question. This weirdly enough, it's a great topic that I love to chat about, because the reality is when I look at vulnerability management, I don't know why I'm getting philosophical on everybody here, but when I think about vulnerability management in general, it is actually a subset of risk management. And risk management, when you think about it, is just the process of basically trying to look at your overall business picture and your business risk and what could happen, and determining what the probability of different events are going to be, which is why really like you have a lot of older tools like GRC type solutions that kind of moved into some of this vulnerability management background or process as well, because they really feel like because they do go hand in hand. Like it's interesting when you think about it, because like I could make the argument that vulnerability management data should get shipped to the folks that are actually doing like your old school actuarial style risk management at the business level. And we do see Nucleus is used for those types of solutions, right? So, but again, it's a small piece of a larger purpose. But it's not uncommon for vulnerability data now to be shown in boardrooms, specifically because it really highlights and illustrates the risk that you have as a business, but within a particular part of a larger risk management framework. So normally there'd be like 4 risk slides. One will be physical risks, one will be digital risks, one would be like brand risks, and then the other one would be something that's unique to that business. So that's generally how we would see it happen. But yes, it absolutely would be. And thank you from the audience for setting this straight on.
We are getting a lot of questions, and we're going to try to get them all in. I do want to read a comment that we've gotten that I think is interesting, and I'd love to get your take on it and what your thoughts are hearing this. And so that comment was, we generate user stories from Defender Threat and Vulnerability Management to Azure DevOps and use tagging to send the stories to the correct team. We prioritize based on asset criticality to the business, and where is the asset? Is it publicly internet facing? So I mean, I think that feeds a lot into what you were talking about for an example, but any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'm reading it too over here. I'm gonna tell everybody. So I just want to make sure I'm more of a visual learner.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, basically the comment around generating user stories from Defender Threat and to TVM and Azure DevOps totally makes sense. The ability to use tagging to send the stories to the correct team. I mean, that right there, I mean, that is a basic automation of how to do certain things, right? And so it's an awesome workflow to manage. The question that I would have for you is, how do you roll that out across all of the different workflows and all of the tools? Because you probably have coverage over a portion of your infrastructure, but then it's how do you start to do that with all of your other tooling as well? So like you might be using, Microsoft TVM, but I don't know, are you using, and you got Azure DevOps to use tagging, but it's like, okay, well, how are you making sure that your cloud resources are good? How are you like tracking your different types of assets? So I think of an example like the following, right? Like we actually this just came up today. We had a customer who was using both CrowdStrike and Microsoft Defender TVM. And they were thinking about getting rid of Microsoft Defender TVM because they were like, hey, why would we need both? And when they looked at it, they looked at Nucleus and they said, oh, there's something weird here. Like CrowdStrike's not reporting something, or they're reporting it as gone, but Microsoft isn't. And so by using that, they were able to determine that actually CrowdStrike was able to see that the vulnerability had been fixed, but the workstation needed to be rebooted. And so they needed to actually utilize both to make that happen. And so the question is, how do you stitch, if you're using Azure DevOps in this example, how do you stitch all of your upstream tools into Azure DevOps to make those workflows work? And how do you do that in a way where you don't just like leverage manual work to automatically or to manual work to tag everything? It's how do you start to build that into your CI pipeline? And honestly, ADO is a great tool for that because it ties so tightly with Git repositories. You can actually basically, as you're making commits, as you're doing PRs, you can do auto tagging based on the team and the project and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's a great, whoever posted that on LinkedIn, great work.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great ones coming in, and I'll go ahead and forewarn you, Scott. I think we're going to try, because we love to please our audience, to address most of these questions coming in the time we're spending here today. And to be fair, if we need to do a second session, a third session to follow up to address on some of those other topics that we had planned, we'll do that, because these questions that are coming in are great and they tie right into this stuff that we're talking about anyway. So just wanted to give you a heads up. So first one that I want to throw at you, because I think this is one that a lot of people think, right? And this is about the Tenable and Qualys question. So it says both Tenable and Qualys have integrations with ServiceNow that can assist with automating remediation processes. Could you speak to what benefits there would be to using a tool like Nucleus, like the Nucleus platform, versus one of those integrations? And I think we hear that question a lot. So I'm glad someone asked this, because I would love for us to be able to address that here.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is one of my favorite questions, to be honest, because I get to talk all about this one. I get to talk all about me and all about Nucleus, which is great. But so there's a few layers to this question. So the Tenable and Qualys question is, well, as Nucleus always says, we are a tool that really solves scale challenges as much as anything else. And so if you're a small network, let's say you got 500 assets or 1,000 assets, and you're just scanning with Tenable, and you're only doing Tenable, and you're going to leverage the ServiceNow plugin from Tenable, you can get by with that, right? You don't need a sophisticated solution like a Nucleus to be able to solve VM challenges. There are some issues that you run into with those because they're designed to be vulnerability discovery tools, not necessarily like remediation was tacked on. So like, for example, we see scenarios where like Tenable is not great at asset management, right? So one of the core use cases that we do with Tenable information, just by uploading Tenable data to Nucleus, we can determine, hey, this unauthenticated scan and this authenticated scan are actually the same asset, where Tenable struggles with that. And now if we wanted to tie that with endpoints, let's say you've got Tenable plus we have a Microsoft Defender because we need EDR on top of our vulnerability scanning, how do we put those assets together? Still 1,000 assets, but now you've got two data sources. It becomes doubly or triply as complex because now you have to sift through all the extra data. How do you normalize and correlate all of the vulnerability data there? And so when you start to layer on additional data sources, when you start to layer on size, it becomes really critical to have a tool like a Nucleus that's designed to deal with management of the information, plus the information that you're getting from the scanning tools. Right. So that's really the short answer. I could probably talk about this for 45 minutes just on its own.
Yes, but we're gonna do some other ones first. Yeah, and I think the biggest takeaway out of that really is to understand that Nucleus is meant to complement a lot of your existing systems, right? We have partnerships with a ton of integrations, which you can learn more about on our website. I like this other question we've gotten. Actually, I like them all, so keep them coming because I'm going to try to fit in as many as I can. But here's a question. A scaling issue for us is helping IT admins with complex remediations. These would be ones that require actions beyond a patch. Everyone classically seems to think just applying a patch is all that is ever needed to remediate a vulnerability. We are trying to build a remediation community in our org where they can help each other out and write a one-page doc when they do figure out a complex remediation to help build a shared knowledge base. Do you know of any other tactics for this, or really just, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this, I would say you've hit on one of the areas in the industry where the industry is probably the weakest. Because if you look at, and this is something that if you just think about prioritization in general, like that question of level of effort or that question of what do we do about a vulnerability is a challenge across the board. Even when you're trying to figure out what should I fix, who's going to be who can I assign this vulnerability to? Because you might be in a situation where based on the capabilities of your organization, some folks in your organization or some teams can only run patches, but for vulnerabilities that require more than a patch or even a compensated control, then you actually need a different team that's responsible for it. And so how do you track SLAs on that? How do you track who's going to get dinged when they're not doing their job? Those kinds of things, right? So you've hit on a really fundamental question. And the first answer is what you're doing inside your organization, I think is a really great step. If you can pull off like a remediation database of sorts inside your org, that's great. Especially when it comes to really good documentation. It's the same thing as every other change. It's a change management problem as much as it is anything else. So I would really say make sure that you're bringing your IT teams and your team leads into that because they know more about their systems than we do as security folks most of the time. And so we really need to build that in a collaborative way. I think that's a great step. The other thing that you can do is you can start to categorize vulnerabilities into these different types of workflows, and then you can actually treat them differently. And so what I do end up having, I think of it a little bit like I don't know how many of you have been involved in like a sales process before, right? But in like a business to business sale, you have some organizations that let's call them like they have over $1 billion in revenue and 10,000 employees. And then you have other organizations which have like 500 or 700 employees. The way that you have to sell to them is it's fundamentally different, right? So like a smaller company is generally a lot easier to sell to because they generally have they have less requirements. So think of these as the ones that we can just patch, right? It's like you click a button and you go on your way because there's a lot less stuff to do with it. But then you have a different set of organizations that require a ton of handholding. They require a ton of extra time and attention and work. And so the question is, what you do in that case is you have to start to specialize. So the best strategy that we've seen is not just to create a remediation database like you're doing or remediation like kind of walkthroughs, but it's also to start really thinking about who within your organization is capable of just doing patches and who's capable of doing more than just patches. And then you need to really focus your time on two different engineering tracks. And we've even seen it done where you have like, hey, only developers that are level 3 and above are like able to touch these vulnerabilities. And then your challenge becomes how do you route and assign those vulnerabilities and know that those are the ones to assign to those folks. But you generally have to consolidate. The unfortunate reality is you have to start consolidating the more difficult challenges to the folks that are more equipped for it, which is when you think about it, a little unfortunate because the biggest resource constraint in an organization is generally not the number of engineers that you have. It's the number of these 3 engineers that just know how to do, they can make anything happen. Like it's your magicians. You have your resource constrained in magicians, not necessarily in your engineering organization. So you have to be really critical. You have to prioritize. You have to start thinking like a product owner, and you have to really be what's the word I'm looking for? You have to be really brutal with your prioritization, and you have to decide what's the stuff that we can live with not getting fixed, and what's the stuff that has to get fixed. And then you make sure you route the most critical stuff that also with the high level of effort or not just a patch to the people that you know are able to fix it. And then you have to communicate that effectively. So to your point, what you're doing is a great step, but you also have to start thinking about your organization as a whole and specialization within it. So those are the two areas. But you're halfway there. Good news.
Yeah, I do that. I'll give 2 thumbs up on that as well. All right. Here's a good one. I'm going to try my best to read it. I'm going to fix probably some things in here, but what can you expect from Nucleus when it comes to capacity, individual teams having to remediate vulnerabilities? Meaning one team may have 20 personnel to work on 100 criticals, whereas another may have 100 personnel to work on 20 criticals. How will Nucleus handle assigning these vulns in the future? Are there any capabilities now? And is there some sort of threshold that we can try to set for our teams? And this is great because we were just talking about SLAs right before we got on this call. So yep. There you go.
This is great. I actually did like a 2-minute video on this last week on this very topic. So This is a great question. It's one that I get all the time. And this is one that I've been thinking about over the years. And ultimately, we're blocked as an industry by the amount of work that's required to implement the actual write process. The actual write process, if if you're thinking about this at the highest level, is that you should be treating teams in a very personalized way. So if one team has 100 people available to fix vulnerabilities, and you should be putting pressure on them equal to what they're capable of doing. So if you think of every single team on their own level of like their own maturity scale, then you can create basically different problem sets for them. So if your team that has 100 users, maybe you give them 100 vulnerabilities to fix. Maybe the team that has 20 users, you give them 20 vulnerabilities to fix in the short term. And then you start to ratchet it up over time based on how they're doing against that. But you really, unfortunately, have to treat them as individual teams, because you cannot apply a blanket process or policy across everybody. Because what'll happen is you get this weird skew where this team has nothing to work on and this team has way too much to work on. And so then you get into this weird thing where it's like, well, do we shift people from here to over there? Which you don't want to have happen. What you want is for every team to basically come into their own on their own kind of standard, right? And so the easiest way to do this generally is through SLAs and creating like an SLA maturity roadmap, where you would say, hey, we've determined through some threat modeling that we do that there's a set of vulnerabilities we want to fix within 48 hours. That's level zero. Like level zero of success of SLAs is that, are we meeting all of our vulnerabilities that need to be fixed within 48 hours across the teams? And then every team that then you define your second tier and your third tier, and every tier moves that team up a level. And then you set your SLAs, you set your expectations for the teams based on the level of maturity that they're at. And then you can do a maturity leaderboard at that point. So we have a lot of content about that particular issue. I'm sure Danny and Sonia will link it, because I am
Yes.
I don't know where it is.
Well, and not only that, this is really timely. I mean, seeing all these questions coming in, because we've been talking a lot about what our 2024 strategy is for content, and we want to put a focus on education. We want to put a focus on being thought leaders, being able to share our viewpoint on recommendations we would make from what we've seen with customers that we've seen be successful with making some changes. And so you'll see a lot more coming from Nucleus, even if there isn't any content available right now on a specific thing that you ask. Let me ask you this. So this is about, the shift left security approach. And so the question was, how do you maintain a shift left security approach with a Devcentric approach for AppSec using Nucleus? In other words, bringing findings closure to the dev.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the reality is that I hear this a lot. It's a great question, but it's also a pet peeve of mine at the same time. And there's two reasons for that. The first is, again, I'm a big believer in personalizing your processes based on your organization's makeup. And so the whole concept of shifting left is great, but it also leaves behind the fact that there's already stuff out there in production. So when I think of shift left, I actually classify it as what's in production and what are my processes for production vulnerabilities versus pre-production. And when I think of shift left, I'm thinking of everything that's pre-production and how do we build it into the developer lifecycle and pipelines up there. But I also just don't want to lose sight of the fact that you have these post-production vulnerabilities that need to be managed as well. And generally there's not enough resources to do both or to do them both effectively. And so it is a little bit of a balancing act. So there we go. That's like sort of I made my piece there. Now, as far as how do you use Nucleus to work with pre-production vulnerabilities? This is a pretty common use case for Nucleus is, hey, we are a hardware provider who needs to ship firmware out to new, to different devices in an OT environment. And we want to be able to ensure that it's all hunky dory before we do that. So the way that normally would work is that you would actually build Nucleus into your CI pipeline if you have CI pipelines. If you don't have CI pipelines, you basically want to push all this data up into Nucleus. We can do this through your repository tooling like GitHub, Bitbucket, those kinds of things as well. But let's say you're like using like a checkmark SAST scanner, right? You take your checkmarks scan that happens when you're committing code, you create your PR. That data gets uploaded to Nucleus. It gets funneled through all of the logic that you have built into your Nucleus console, and then gets pushed back out to your to your developer that says, hey, you had 3 vulnerabilities that came up that don't meet these quality gates that we're looking for. And the beauty of a tool like Nucleus is that it works across all of your tools. So you don't have to maintain a bunch of configurations in checkmarks, in SonarQube, in Mend, all like depending on the tools that each team is using. So Nucleus you can think of as like a centralized quality assurance, and gating type of solution at that level. And the idea is that developer pushes code, data goes into Nucleus, data goes back out and to the developer that pushed that code based on the information that and the policies that you set inside of Nucleus. So that's kind of the short answer.
Okay. And then I've got one for you that kind of relates to this loosely, but this is about handling mitigating controls, right? So for instance, if you have a critical vuln on a host behind the firewall, could be less important than a high or medium vuln that is exposed to the internet. So really, how do you manage that? How do we view that? That's what this question is about. I figured that was kind of loosely related to where we were going here.
Yeah, I mean, the short cheeky answer, if you will, is like, that's why we built Nucleus, right? Like, I mean, the reality is that was effectively my job and my 2 co-founders' jobs before we built this product. And it was an uphill battle the whole time, right? It was, we were even in these situations where we would mark something as a false positive, and then the auditor would come in and say, hey, what about this vulnerability? Well, it's a false positive. Well, it showed up in the latest scan. So how do you even just document that you marked something with a mitigating control so you can show it to an auditor without having to go like, and we weren't part of the GRC team, so we weren't able to access the GRC to do that. So the way that, I mean, Nucleus was basically built to solve that particular issue. So we have this concept that we call a justification. So you have a finding. Finding can either be active or not active, and not active is generally resolved. And so what'll happen is you'll go to your active finding. You can do this either manually or automatically, depending on policies and stuff that you set up. But you would go and you'd say, hey, this vulnerability, this particular instance of a vulnerability, or maybe all vulnerabilities on this asset actually have a compensating control in place. So we're going to literally mark it as compensating control. We are going to adjust the risk down based on that. You get to choose how you'd like to handle it. Now, Nucleus, like, you can either do that via statuses, you can do it via like the priority rating, but you get to choose how you would like to handle that. Then the question just becomes, how do you actually get the data of what those compensating controls are into Nucleus? And we will preserve the history of all those compensating controls. But then it's just, how do you get them in there? And you can either do that, manually. You can farm that out to all your different teams that are tracking it already. You can ingest it via, API. You can do it via custom file upload, custom data upload. So there's a lot of options to do that. But yes, I mean, we view ourselves as the status tracking and the compensating control tracking system for your vulnerabilities. So that's the way we look at it.
Awesome. Okay, I like this one a lot. It came earlier, but we didn't get a chance to bring it up yet. I have confidence you'll be able to handle this one. The question is, automating vulnerability remediation in theory sounds great, but is it really feasible? Possibly on workstations, but servers, networking devices, and other assets need to be tested thoroughly before making a change. Thoughts?
Oh, I have so many thoughts.
I know you do.
So Sonia and I have had this conversation probably numerous times through the years, and every single time I end up on the top of a table shouting into the ether. So yeah, so when it comes to automated patching or automated remediation, I have some pretty strong opinions about this, and most of the time it's not a good idea, is what I would say. It sounds really great on the surface, but it is really risky to do that. I basically, when I think about classifying vulnerabilities again, there are the ones that we should allow to be automatically patched and the ones that we should not allow to be automatically patched. Now, when it comes to workstations, I mean, just setting up auto patching is generally like a decent enough strategy for like a lower level of maturity. And you don't even necessarily need to think about like automated patching. The challenge really comes in when you're trying to like automatically fix code. You're trying to automatically patch a server. Like, I just think about the change management processes exist for a reason. And also the idea that you, especially us as Nucleus, this security solution, is going to automatically patch like a critical server against the IT team's will. Like, they have change windows, they have these like change processes in place to minimize risk. Like, IT teams are very anti-change, right? Like that they want that. That's why we still have mainframes and COBOL and all this stuff, right? Is they're not very they're very risk averse. They're not very like, yes to risk. And so ultimately, every time you push a patch, every time you do an update to a system, especially a critical system, it comes with risk. There's inherent risk there. I mean, like we even think about this. It's like we're talking about updating our website, and it's like, oh, there's risk associated with that because Google's not going to see it as well, or somebody's not going to know where the demo on demand button is anymore, whatever, right? Like there's always risk associated with these things. And so I'm generally anti like automatically pushing patches to servers. I'm good with it with workstations. I think that's a totally fine level of risk to accept. But you as a business need to decide what level of risk you're willing to accept to push the envelope there. And we generally see that, especially in larger organizations, that the juice is not worth the squeeze because you're going to fix only a small percentage of vulnerabilities because these are the ones that can be patched. They're not the ones that need to be tested very heavily. And so generally you'd want to work through your change management process. So when I think about automated remediation, I really think of it more as what processes need to be in place to get the right information to the right people with the right context so that they can make the right decisions. So anyway, that's the way I like to look at it, more so than, hey, let's YOLO some patches out there to maybe a workstation, a server that's processing a terabyte of data anymore.
Well, and I was going to say, and the way that I would summarize that coming from product marketing is like really we're enabling you to more quickly and to more efficiently and precisely remediate. That's really where we would fit in. So there was a question about vulnerabilities from a hide infrastructure. It was, in your point of view, what are the major criteria to handle multiple vulnerabilities?
Yeah, we could do it. We should probably do a whole session /
We're
webinar.
gonna. I think we're gonna take a lot of these topics because there's a lot of really good questions that came up here. So definitely stay tuned because I think we will do a lot of follow-ups. But yeah, do you want to touch on that at all before we because I know we're down to 9 minutes, but I thought maybe you might want to address that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's very situation dependent, I would say. And so it's going to be hard for me to give a really good answer in 9 minutes here.
Yeah.
So that would be one I'd like to follow up with whoever asked that question so we could get more info, and happy to talk about it. But it's very dependent on what your goals of your organization are and what you're really trying to accomplish as a security team, because it can be very culturally dependent as well on how you want to handle that. But generally, you would look at how do you correlate. Basically, I always look at how do you simplify, how do you correlate, normalize, and then distill that, and then give information in a very simple way. So if you're thinking about, hey, this vulnerability versus that vulnerability, you need to effectively determine what's important to you, and then apply that framework of what's important to us to each of the vulnerabilities, and you can decide how you want to handle those. And sometimes you might want to even deduplicate them, even if they're not technically the same thing, because you want to be able to say, hey, it's the same fix, right? There's a lot of different ways you can handle that. But yeah, that's a much bigger topic.
Okay, fair. And then we have you found best practices in infrastructure naming, data, or integration paths to correlate to an application? Thinking that is still a heavy and manual process outside a platform or inside a platform, but wondering if there are discovery tools that can help stitch these together. CMDBs are always difficult to build given various maturities and change management process inside organizations.
Man, I feel like I'm amongst a bunch of peers that really understand
They
me.
feel it. I know this is more like a workshop is really what this,
Yeah.
this is a working session today.
No, this is one of my favorite topics as well. You guys have been just hitting it out of the park with the questions today.
I have been.
So this is an amazing question, because this has been the bane of so many previous jobs that I've had, and the bane of my existence for a long period of time. And sometimes you have what you can control, and then you have things that you can't control. So I think about asset naming, right? Or an internal IP range. How do we know that this asset is the same as this other asset, or that it's not the same, even though they have the same host name and IP address? Because somebody in my organization decided to go from one department to another department, and they knew how to use their Cisco, firepower module the same way, and they didn't want to have to change anything. So they just use the exact same internal IP space, and now you've got collisions, right? This is a really big challenge. There's definitely best practices with this. But I would say that in the security side, and then a lot of smaller organizations that grow into bigger organizations, those best practices are not followed very well. And so how do you start to determine what assets or what is one of those things that is one of the bigger problems of our time that I think we're starting to get figure out how to solve. Now, to answer the question specifically, there are tools out there specifically to try to solve this problem. Gartner calls that the CASM space. So the CAASM, it's cyber attack surface management, cyber asset attack surface management. And so there's a lot of tools out there like that, but you could also leverage tools like Nucleus, for example, to help you with that, right? We give you a lot of visibility into that because what we're doing is we're integrating with all of these upstream data sources, and we're building an asset inventory inside of Nucleus that you could then push into a ServiceNow or a CMDB. And the other thing that I do want to caution everybody against is there's a scarcity mindset versus like an abundance mindset. A lot of folks, they don't want to take any action within VM until they feel like they've got a good handle on their CMDB situation, because we've only got 30% coverage. Well, what I just want to caution against is saying, oh, we've only got 30% coverage, so we're going to do nothing over here. That's a dangerous game to play because vulnerabilities are going to continue to stack up and vulnerability debt's going to continue to go up. And this team over here could really use that 30%, even if there's only 30%. And so it gives so much additional structure to huge swaths of data, because you might not think, oh, 30% might not be that much. But if you got 50 million vulnerabilities and you could do that with 30% of your vulnerabilities, all of a sudden that's a pretty big set of your infrastructure that you can start to manage in a more effective way. So sort of a two-part answer. Yes, there are tools out there that can do that. I guess it's a three-part answer. Yes, Nucleus can help you even with something like that, or a VM solution that's aggregating information into a system like this because of the breadth of sources that we integrate with. And then third, really definitely be careful with your processes and things there. But I'm happy to go into more detail. In fact, I probably should go into more detail at another point. But yeah, like one of the core problems that we had to solve in the early days of Nucleus was, hey, these guys over here use the same exact host name and potentially even MAC address as these people over here. And so what do we do about that? And how do we deduplicate and know assets, which assets are which is again, layer on that Tenable doesn't know what assets are which either. And we have to be able to clean that up on ingest. So we have a lot of experience with this and definitely happy to talk more about it.
Absolutely. So I want to take a moment to just thank everyone that joined us today. If you bear with us just 2 more minutes, we'll give you some really great information on where you can learn more, not only about Nucleus, but like just general vulnerability management education, and also our next upcoming webinar. And there is a better way to do vulnerability management no matter where you are now, especially with smart automation at your fingertips that helps accelerate the work you're doing while also lightening it. So here at Nucleus, we try to help empower our customers to not only work on, but also track and report on the vulnerabilities that actually matter instead of spending tons of man hours on those that don't. You will receive a follow-up email with key takeaways and links to the on-demand version of this webinar. I know we did not get to every single question, so we will make sure to follow up with you. I'm sure after we get off of here, we'll start talking about some follow-up sessions as well, since it seems to be something that sits well with a lot of you. We hope that you walk away with a little more knowledge, at least, on streamlining and automating your vulnerability management process, that we have a lot more topics to touch on in the future. Next month, if you're interested, we will be talking about one of the most popular buzzwords in the industry, which is single pane of glass, or SPOG, and what that actually looks like in vulnerability management. Registration is now open on our website and LinkedIn page, and you can also use the QR code here. Please feel free to connect with myself and Scott on socials. We're both on LinkedIn. I know that the links were sent out earlier, or you can also find more about Nucleus on our website. And I know there were a few questions about integrations. We will make sure that we follow up with you as well to give you answers on where we are with those. And with that, I will close this webinar because we are right at the end. Scott, anything else that you want to add before we hop off?
Well, no, I appreciate the time. Of course, Drew dropped in my favorite question of the day 3 minutes ago. That I'm not gonna have, but I am definitely Drew. You can expect an email from me.
Yes.
Because I want to answer that question for you.
Yes.
But yeah, appreciate the time, everybody. Obviously, if you want to connect with us, let us know. We're obviously, you know where to find us, and just be aware that we're going to be putting out a lot more content like this in the future. Yes. We're really big into process and process stuff about that. So like we just did a big series on SLAs, for example. Yes. So check all that.
With much more to come. And we saved all of the questions that you all submitted, so none have been lost. We will make sure we review every single one. So again, thank you and stay safe. We hope you all have a great rest of your day, evening, or whatever time it is, since you're from all over the world. So take care, everyone.
Everybody.
We'll see you.